This is part 3 of my discussion about Richard Day's presentation, I guess you could call it, where he reveals the strategy for the New World Order. So what we come to next? Hunting. Well, it's unsurprising they had to broach hunting, because hunting involves guns, and gun control was a massive element to these plans. Dr. Dunnigan, who really was responsible for transcribing all this, said he didn't remember in detail what they said about gun ownership, but that gun ownership should be a privilege rather than a right, and not everyone should have guns. Well, I don't think we need any more explaining about that. I totally understand the Americans' view on guns, that it's a last recourse against a tyrant government gone rogue. He then went on to talk about sports for girls in order to de-emphasize femininity. Now, I don't have any problem with sports for girls. I think that's quite normal, but I can definitely understand the de-emphasizing of femininity and the kind of merging of the sexes, because that is a plan that's come to fruition in the last 3 to 4 years with this whole pushing of the trans, non-binary agenda, kind of seeding it early in children's lives so they begin to question their gender identity, which I think shouldn't be a focus. Focus should be on good health rather than getting obsessed with a gender identity, which I think in most cases isn't actually an issue, but they're kind of making it one. He then went on to talk about entertainment, violence, sex, and desensitization. So he said movies would gradually get more and more explicit in terms of sex, language, rough sex, a lot more violence, a lot more pornographic movies in the theaters, on TV, etc. He said there were no VCRs around at that time. However, Dr. Day indicated that there would be a time when cassettes would be available, and there'd be sort of cassette players that for use in the home, and it would make it a lot easier for people to access pornography because they could buy these video cassettes of pornography and use them. So I'm not well versed in what people were doing to satisfy their pornographic needs back in the 60s, but obviously the advent of the VCR, the Betamax, made it a hell of a lot easier to enjoy porn when and where you wanted to in the privacy of your own home. Obviously, when people are watching porn, look, I'm not an expert on this, but people do say that it does cause dissatisfaction in relationships. It creates unrealistic expectations, and it leads to the demise of relationships of family. People are more likely to have affairs, that sort of thing. So I think we can throw that in the category of destruction of the family. He also talks about violence being made a lot more graphic, and he said the reason was to desensitize people to violence, because he said there would be a time when people would witness real-life violence and be part of it. That was where society is headed. So people had to see more and more realistic violence in entertainment, so it would make it easier for them to accept violence and not be aghast at the sight of dead people or injured people. So he suggested that part of the New World Order plan was for events that would involve numerous human casualties, which survivors would see. So they needed to seed that in films. You can see also a lot of these films seed kind of robots, to get people ready for the AI takeover, and also to adjust people to accepting cyborgs, some sort of human artificial intelligence chimera. We see loads of it. Look, don't ask me. I don't watch those movies. Can't stand that sort of stuff. But I'm sure I don't have to elaborate because you guys will know what I mean. Okay, the next category kind of made me laugh because it said music will get worse. The topic was that no new sugary romantic music would be publicized. All of the music that was written before would be confined to sort of oldies channels like the gold FM or the classic FM or maybe like kind of the smooth FM, whatever. So they'd sort of consign all the good old stuff to the oldies stations, and for the older people, and the younger people would listen to music that would get worse and worse and worse. So that made me laugh because I think all of us tend to think as we get older that music is getting a heck of a lot worse. I mean, for me it was great in the 80s, quite partial to the 70s as well, and I wouldn't say that there's been anything that great. I mean, a handful of great stuff in the last 20 years, but I think that's just age speaking. So here's one of these things where I think it's just all about progress and tastes changing, and there's not necessarily a nefarious purpose. The next topic was give us the young. And there was this notion that entertainment would be a tool to influence young people. They thought, well, don't worry about the older people. They can't be changed. You can't teach old dogs new tricks, but you're really going to get in the minds and the heads of young people via putting all these subliminal messages and more overt messages in both songs and books and theatre and everything. Now, what I immediately thought of there is, do you know Marina Abramovich, her kind of protege is Lady Gaga. So I thought, well, of all people, I suppose they are going to promote Lady Gaga over and above other artists because she's pushing an image they want to push. And like you guys, I said in a vlog quite a while ago now, and I said Harry Potter obviously was ticking the right boxes, which is why it got discovered, promoted to such a great extent, and became successful. Things become successful because the marketing is right, not necessarily because the content is that wonderful. So I think the message in Harry Potter, which is bordering on kind of occult themes to a large extent, definitely mirrors an image that the elites want children to have. So there's obviously messaging both in Lady Gaga, in the way she presents herself, in her costumes, in her performances, and there's messaging in Harry Potter that they want young people to get, which is why these particular things become super, super successful. They really pushed. Can't elaborate exactly on that, but anyway. So let's go to this. This is where it gets really on point, particularly for now. He talks about the 80s and the 90s. Now remember, they're about 20 years off schedule, maybe more. He talks of the Grim Reaper, travel restrictions, national identity, and the chip. So he says gradually things would tighten up and tighten up. Then the tightening would be accelerated. Eventually old movies, old songs would be withdrawn. You can see why it's important to do that, because otherwise people are going to realize, young people are going to watch TV programs, films, whatever, from the 80s and before, and they're going to think, gee, the life then looks great. The life we're living now is horrible. They can't have people making that comparison because they've got to really accept now as being good. But it'll be very easy to look back at old films, music, to observe old television programs and realize the freedoms people had and the wonderful lifestyle people had and the prosperity, and to compare it to now and realize how horrible it is. So you can see they definitely need to phase out the old stuff. So he said travel would become very restricted. People would need permission to travel and a very good reason to travel. And if you didn't have a good reason for your travel, you wouldn't be allowed to. You can see that they definitely would want that for under the guise of climate, because it would be, oh, you're going to have these points. So once you've used up your points for a year, that's your travel. So you get your 1 week in the sun, whether it be in Spain or Florida if you're in the US, or maybe Bali if you're in Australia, and that's it, folks. That's all. And you can see now, even with the restrictions, particularly in Ireland, that you can't go beyond 2 kilometers from your house. You can see that kind of coming in, and it certainly seems to me that under the guise of being kind to the climate, that this kind of thing would happen. So everyone would need ID, especially to travel, even within borders. First, there'd be an ID card that you'd carry on your person, and you would have to show it where you're asked for it. That already is de rigueur in certain countries. Obviously, we don't have that in the United Kingdom. So it was already planned back then that some sort of device would be developed to be implanted under the skin. It would be coded specifically to identify the individual, and this would eliminate the possibility of falsifying your ID, and also eliminate the possibility of people saying, oh, well, I lost my ID. Oh, the dog ate my ID. Oh, I flushed it down the loo when I was drunk. You won't be able to use those excuses, will you? They said back then that the difficulty with these skin-implanted IDs would be getting material that would just stay under the skin without causing, restrictions or some sort of bodily reaction, So they needed to make sure that would stay under the skin, obviously. Obviously, with the advent of nanotechnology, achieving all this has become so much easier. Back then, they were worried about how they'd imprint enough information and record information on these sort of under-the-skin devices that could be retrieved by a scanner. And silicon was mentioned, but silicon at the time was thought not to be well tolerated by the body, although, of course, it was used for breast enlargements, right? So silicon was then seen as a promising material, and so they were looking at it. Obviously, as you know, we've now marched on, and there are mini computers that can be held between the mandibles of an ant. So imagine how small they are. They've probably got even smaller since I read that, which wasn't so long ago. He talks then about food control, saying that food supplies would come under tight control, especially if population didn't slow. We see that with the rationing, that's come on with this COVID. Just another example of how COVID is advancing the strategies outlined here. So ultimately, whether the population slows down or not, the food supply had to be brought under centralized control so that people would have enough to be well nourished, but they wouldn't have enough to support any fugitive from the new system. So if you had a friend or a relative who was a dissident, hadn't signed up, they would find a way to disrupt that person's ability to get food, and you wouldn't be able to help them because you'd only have enough food to feed yourselves. And of course, growing one's own food would be outlawed under some sort of pretext, like saying, oh, it's not safe, or it's not hygienic, or it needs to be radiated or chlorinated, etc. Obviously, the ostensible purpose would be that growing your own vegetables wasn't safe and it could spread disease, and it was protecting you. But the real purpose would be to limit the food supply. Bill Gates is also heavily invested in Burger King and in meat. What do you call it? They take genetic material from the muscles in a cow's body, and then they use it to create meat artificially by propagating or causing those cells to replicate, to create meat in a factory rather than it being organically grown. So Bill Gates is into that. But once you can make meat without the cow, that further destroys the farming community, and that further destroys people's ability to get meat direct from a farmer, because you have to be getting meat. Just like with the seeds with Monsanto, you then become totally dependent on your seeds every year from Monsanto, so they can quickly cut you off if you're not playing ball. So farmers aren't keeping cattle where you can, obviously in the traditional time-honored way, slaughter the cattle and eat the meat. But if you reliant on Bill Gates's genetically modified meat that's grown in a factory, well, you're dependent on Big Pharma again, or Bill Gates, aren't you? They wanted to talk about weather control. Now, do you know there are articles dating back to 1910 in newspapers in Australia about weather control? It had started back then. The technology is now very advanced. And we're not just talking about, a cloud here, cloud there, absolute weather control. He made a really striking statement. He said, we can or soon will be able to control the weather. And he said, I'm not merely referring to dropping iodide crystals into the clouds to precipitate rain that's already there, but real control. Weather was seen as a weapon of war, a weapon of influencing public policy. It could make rain or withhold rain in order to influence certain geographical regions and bring them under control. So that was really striking to me, because we don't yet perceive that one, or it's not talked about. Although a friend of mine who lives down in Devon did say that there's a wide suspicion there that the widespread floods, that region of England, which, if you don't know, is in the southeast or southwest of England, they suffered dreadful flooding about, was it 7? I don't know, the time's flown, maybe 7-8 years ago. And she said that was genetically engineered to destroy the agricultural industry in that part of the world. So there you go. So he said, on one hand, you can make drought during the growing season so that nothing will grow. On the other hand, you can make for very heavy rains during the harvest season so that the fields are too muddy to bring to harvest. Indeed, one can do both. So guys, when you see strange weather, for example, the fires in Australia, we should always be suspicious that there's not a political agenda being sought. He said that very few people really know how government works. Something to the effect that elected officials are influenced in ways that people don't even realize. He suggested very often that politicians carry out plans that have been made for them, and they actually think they're the authors of those plans, but actually they've been manipulated in ways that they don't even understand. So he said, the key is knowing how people will respond and making them do what you want. He said people can carry on in their minds and act upon two contradictory ideas at one time, provided that these two contradictory ideas are kept far enough apart. Another statement, he said, is you can know pretty well how rational people are going to respond to certain circumstances or certain information they encounter. So to determine the response you want, you need only control the kind of data or information that they're presented, or the kinds of circumstances that they're in. And being rational, they do what you want them to do. They may not fully understand why they're doing it, or what they're doing. I think that's a case of problem, reaction, solution. We see that with the mainstream media. holding the narrative, which is much more difficult now that people have lost trust in them because of the fantastic alternate media. He talked then about falsified scientific research. So there was a statement admitting that some scientific research data could and indeed had been falsified in order to bring about the desired results. Dr. Day said, and we've heard this from him before, that people don't ask the right questions and that people are too trusting. I will note that that happens a lot with climate science, but I also believe that Stephen Hawking is not what we are led to believe. I don't think he was compos mentis for a very long time. He had words put in his mouth because he wasn't able to control, well, the obvious. And I feel that a lot of what he put forward in terms of mathematical theory and scientific theory is what they want you to believe and is a red herring and will detract people and send people chasing, well, send off all the people chasing off to the wrong bones. So I feel that there's a big hoax going on there and people should be very critical about everything he was postulating, particularly because most journalists aren't good at maths. A lot of people aren't good at maths. Very few people have studied maths in enough detail to be able to critically evaluate anything that he was saying. So everyone's relying on third and fourth hand information. It's all basically hearsay by the time it gets to the press. There's no way of any one journalist understanding enough about maths to be able to comment on whether the stuff was googledygook or whatever. So I think that's part of a con, and I think that's part of a science we are meant to be looking the other way. I think Jeffrey Epstein and those guys he was getting together with, they know the real science, and we are being fed a lot of hogwash to keep us away from discovering it. So Dr. Dunnigan said he found this quite interesting because all the people at the conference were doctors of medicine, and they were supposedly very objective and dispassionately scientific, science being to them the be-all and end-all. And to admit that scientific research, would be falsified in that kind of setting would have seemed like blasphemy in a church. You just don't do it. So it was odd to him that people were so kind of accepting of it, because he would have thought the thinking back then would have been, no way, no, how can this possibly happen? Anyhow, all of this would come to the new international governing body, probably through the UN and a world court. Well, we know there's numerous. There's the IMF, the WHO, obviously the UN, the world court, all these big global bodies who are totally unaccountable, unelected, don't get audited, don't seem to undergo any scrutiny. They are consistently pushing agendas. And as we find now, Bill Gates is funding many of them, so totally unobjected. But he said it could also be brought about in other ways. So he said key to this New World Order was the acceptance of the UN, and the key phrase was the end justifies the means, which of course we've heard that in communism, isn't that so? Mao Zedong and Stalin, that was their thing. The end justifies the means. So he said acceptance of the UN at that time was not widespread, as they hoped for. They were quite disappointed, and efforts would continue to give the United Nations increasing importance, and people would get more and more used to the idea of relinquishing some national sovereignty. The pooling of sovereignty we see in the UN, isn't that so? He said economic interdependence would foster this goal from a peaceful standpoint. Yeah, making every country totally reliant and dependent on another, so there's no incentive to go to war. He said avoidance of war would foster it from the standpoint of, people wouldn't have to worry about hostilities, and it was recognized that you could do this all peacefully. He said at this point that he thought war was obsolete, and Dr. Dunnigan thought that there was a very interesting phrase, because obsolete means that something that was once useful is no longer useful. The reason he was saying that war is obsolete is because he said that because of nuclear bombs, war was no longer controllable. Formerly, he said wars could be controlled, but if nuclear weapons started falling into the wrong hands, there'd be unintended consequences. This is really important because it casts a whole new light on World War I, World War II. I've long said that the companies that operated across enemy lines are the companies that became the biggest and most impactful and the strongest companies in the post-World War II world. And we're talking about companies like IBM, who did the counting machines at the concentration camps, Hugo Boss, who did the Nazi uniforms, and yet there's no stigma, is there, to using any of those two companies. Also AT&T, huge company, IG Farben, and their many subsidiaries, Standard Oil. I mean, there's many, the list goes on. If you think about it, there's no way wars would actually be able to happen unless there was sort of a cooperation at the top in order for supplies and things to sort of fall into place. So I think he's admitting there that in the past wars were manipulated. They weren't just spontaneous uprisings between nations. So it was unclear, said Dr. Dunnigan, who the wrong hands exactly were, but we were free to infer that these are terrorists rather than state actors. So in more recent years, Dr. Dunnigan wondered whether the wrong hands might also include people that, they'd assumed had nuclear weapons all along, like Saddam Hussein and the weapons of mass destruction. So it was very handy to accuse people of having nuclear weapons as a pretext for invasion, isn't that so? So it can be used that way too. So just as it was stated that industry would be preserved in the United States, just a little bit in case the worldwide plans didn't work out, just in case some country or some other powerful person decided to bolt from the pack and go his own way. So one wonders whether this might have also been true with nuclear weapons. So when he said about them falling into the wrong hands, there was some statement that the possession of nuclear weapons had been tightly controlled, sort of implying that anyone who had nuclear weapons was intended to have them. So the whole arms race between the US and the Soviet Union was fabricated, was meant to be that way. So that would have, as he says here, have included the Soviet Union. And he recalled wondering at the time, are you telling us, or are you implying that this country willingly gave weapons to the Soviets? Absolutely. And we know in Chinagate, the Clintons were passing sensitive information over to the Chinese to enhance their military capacity, particularly in air power. But you can bet that other secrets have been passed. Wasn't it true that even North Korea received certain secrets via American universities, via Pakistan? Yes. A whole lot of technology was passed to the Soviet Union, as you can hear more about if you listen to my vlog, Why Capitalists Love Communism. And basically the Soviet Union was set up by US industrialists who supplied all the information, all the technology, all the innovation via concessions and certain arrangements. So yes, that happened. So Dr. Dunnigan said at that time, it seemed unthinkable, really, to admit that they'd been supplying the Soviets with technology to make nuclear weapons and to actually become a competitor to the United States. He thought it sounded crazy at the time. The leaders of the Soviet Union seemed to be so dependent on the West, though, so one wonders whether there may have been some fear they would try and assert independence if they indeed had those weapons. So, he was basically confused about it, let's say that way. So he also pondered about the possible role of terrorism in the future. So anyway, the new system would be brought in. It would maybe be brought in by peaceful cooperation, I think, by a lot of problem, reaction, solution. Make the public beg for it, like people are begging now, for more surveillance to protect them from the great virus. It's quite easy. He said everyone would willingly yield national sovereignty, as we see with the EU and all the people who are such big fans of the EU. They're totally willing to forget all about national sovereignty. They think they can chuck that all in the bin because the advantages they feel outweigh any advantages of national sovereignty. He said if they didn't yield willingly, you could always bring nations to the brink of nuclear war, and then everyone would be so fearful because of the hysteria created about the possibility of nuclear war that there would be such a strong public outcry to negotiate a peace that people would willingly give up national sovereignty in order to achieve peace. Guys, doesn't this just remind you of when David Cameron said we're going to World War III if we have Brexit? It seems dumb now to even think, but that's what the guy was implying, and that's what that statement sort of suggests, huh? So he suggested that the negotiated peace would be very convincing, and you'd have people cheering it on kind of thing, and the context would be totally rehearsed and no one would really know what was going on. People hearing about it would be totally convinced that it was a genuine negotiation between hostile enemies who had finally come to the realization that peace was better than war. As I read that, I was thinking of Reagan and Gorbachev at Reykjavik. I know when I was young, there was a big thing you were hearing about, how great it was, they were talking, and now I wonder, maybe that was just one of those charades. So he went on to say terrorism was a fantastic tool for control. So terrorism would be used widely in Europe and other parts of the world. I think we can say there hashtag Operation Gladio and hashtag ISIS, hashtag Islamic terrorism. So terrorism at that time wasn't really considered even in the United States, but they said it could become necessary in the US if the US didn't move rapidly enough towards accepting the system. Hashtag 9/11, guys. The US wasn't accepting the system, so 9/11, the Patriot Act, and all that jazz. But in the foreseeable future, terrorism wasn't really planned as a big thing. So money and banking. It's quite important now, especially with Uranus in Taurus. So there was a discussion about money and banking, and one statement was, inflation is infinite. You can put an infinite number of zeros after any number and just put the decimal point wherever you want. This was an indication that inflation is a tool for the controllers, that money would become predominantly credit. Money was primarily a credit thing, and the exchange of money would not be in the form of cash or even something palpable. It would be an electronic signal. So back in 1969, what is he hinting at? Cryptocurrency. He said people would begin to carry money only in very small amounts, just to buy stuff like chewing gum or candy bar. Any purchase of significance would be done electronically, earnings would be electronically entered into your account, and there'd be a single banking system. It would have the appearance of being like lots of different banks, but basically it would just be one centralized universal system. Okay, I think we understand that. He said computer records would keep track of whatever you purchased, so, whatever people wanted, there would be a record of everything you'd done, the time, the date, the place, whatever, and someone could review your purchase history and determine exactly what you were buying. So he also stated that any purchase of a significant size, like, a bicycle, a refrigerator, radio, TV, whatever, would carry some sort of identification so it could be traced. I think he's talking about serial numbers, and they do that with mobile phones. Wherever you've purchased a phone, they can trace it back to the purchaser. There'll be some CCTV, so even if you're buying as a pay-as-you-go, they can still trace it back to you. Even if you buy cash, they can probably still trace it to you. So quickly, anything that was stolen or whatever, the authorities can establish who purchased it, when, etc., and computers would play a role. So he said the ability to save would be greatly curtailed. People just wouldn't be able to save to any considerable degree because the expenses, the cost of living would be so high. He said wealth is power, and wealth in the hands of a lot of people really isn't good for the people in charge. So if people are saving too much, they need to be taxed. Yeah, well, you can see what I talked about, the Vulcanist agenda. It's just wiping out the middle class, basically going back to feudalism, consolidation of power. And what are we seeing with this coronavirus? It's going to be a consolidation of wealth up, or redistribution of wealth up. What's being damaged? Small businesses. Big corporations, they're the ones that are going to survive. Just see Amazon. Okay, so he talked about electronic payments would be based on different sorts of credit cards. I mean, these were already in use in 1969, not as widespread as they are now, of course. He talked about an electronic strip, so basically contactless, which is what we've got now, and that people would just carry, all they'd need is this plastic. But he said the next step would be one single card in a skin implant. So right back to 1969, they're talking about this implant that's going to control your everything from your identity to your bank account. Because he said, again, just like ID, if you've got credit cards, they can be lost or stolen. It creates problems, or you can do fraud. But he said if it's implanted in one or other hand, it wouldn't be losable, counterfeitable, or transferable to another person. Your money is totally identified to you, and they can cut you off or freeze you out if they want to. He talked about it being placed under the right hand or on your forehead. It's even sicker if it's on your forehead, I must say. On your right hand, that's mark of the beast that's talked about in Revelations. They mention specifically some sort of mark on your right hand that allows you to do commerce, right? So Dr. Dunnigan goes to say what I just said. When he heard this, he was unfamiliar with the statements in the book of Revelation, but the speaker went on to say, now some of you who read the Bible will attach significance to this, and he went on to disclaim any biblical significance at all. Now guys, any of you who've got Alexa or a new TV, this is one for you. Big Brother is watching you while you're watching TV. Now, we know Alex Jones was saying this ages ago, as was David Icke, and everyone said they're crazy. But now you know. I mean, your TV has the ability to watch you. So there was also mentions of implants that would lead themselves to surveillance by providing radio signals. Yes, exactly. That's the what I talked about in my vlog the other day, the patent number 060606, which is Microsoft patent, which links you to your server to a cryptocurrency, which issues you with tasks. And if you do tasks like watch adverts or engage in some activity, you generate cryptocurrency via this strange system. So you're being totally monitored. Everything from your pulse rate, your eye movements, your energy level are being monitored by your devices and the chip inside you to see if you complete tasks to satisfaction, and then you bag yourself some money. Wonderful to be a slave, isn't it? And also they want to, once they get rid of carbon fossil fuels, we are going to become the power source. So our energy that we generate off our body is going to be tapped some way to be used as a power source. He also talked about putting chips under the skin via dental implants, like when you have your filling, so that fugitives and anyone criticizing this wouldn't know that it had actually gone into them. And these would be identified by a certain frequency from your personal transmitter. You can see that, they say, Bill Gates came up with Microsoft, the whole thing. This was already invented and the people knew back then. These guys like, whether it be Elon Musk, Bill Gates, whoever, they have just been given technology to be the face of that technology. It has to come to light and they need a figurehead for it. All this information has been known definitely from the 60s and they were just waiting for the right time to introduce it. Things aren't really invented. They are just publicized. Someone invented them at some stage, but not the people we think did. More to come on part 4.